I didn't realize how quiet my life had become until silence started answering me back. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy one that settles into a marriage when words stop reaching each other. From the outside, everything looked fine. We lived comfortably, paid our bills on time, attended family dinners, and smiled when expected. But inside our home, I often felt like I was moving through rooms that no longer noticed my presence. My husband was not cruel or unfaithful in the obvious ways. He simply stopped seeing me. Compliments faded first, then encouragement, and eventually even curiosity about who I was becoming. I learned to speak less, to expect less, to shrink my needs into something manageable. There were days I questioned whether I was being dramatic, whether this quiet dissatisfaction was just adulthood settling in. But deep down, I missed feeling capable, admired, and emotionally supported. I missed being reminded that I mattered beyond my responsibilities. When I tried to share those feelings, my husband brushed them aside gently, telling me I was overthinking, that everything was fine. And maybe for him, it was. For me, it felt like slowly disappearing. The idea of piano lessons came unexpectedly. I passed a small music school on my way home from the grocery store one afternoon and stopped without fully understanding why. I had played a little as a child, nothing serious, but the thought of learning again felt like reaching for something I had once loved before life became about practicality. I told my husband about it that evening, half expecting encouragement. He nodded distractedly and said, "If you want," before returning to his phone. That was all, no interest, no support, just permission. My first lesson felt awkward. I was nervous, unsure, and painfully aware of how long it had been since I had tried something new just for myself. My teacher was Italian, calm in a way that made the room feel slower. His accent was gentle, his movements unhurried. He didn't rush me or make me feel foolish for hesitating over simple notes. When I apologized for being rusty, he smiled and said, "You're not behind. You're just beginning again." No one had spoken to me like that in years. Week after week, I returned. Not because I was talented, but because I felt lighter when I left. He noticed small improvements, pointed them out, and treated them as something meaningful. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't inappropriate. It was encouragement, pure and simple, and it unsettled me how deeply that affected me. At home, my husband barely noticed when I practiced, never asked how lessons went. In that quiet contrast, something inside me shifted. I started standing straighter. I started believing I could still grow. I didn't go to piano lessons looking for anything beyond music, but I couldn't ignore the truth forming quietly inside me. Sometimes, what hurts most isn't betrayal. It's realizing how starved you've been for kindness and how easily it comes from someone who simply chooses to see you. I began to notice the change slowly, the way you notice light shifting through a window rather than all at once. Piano lessons stopped feeling like something I squeezed into my week and started feeling like the one place where time behaved differently. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old sheet music, and when I sat at the piano, the world outside softened. My teacher never rushed me. He waited, even through my mistakes, as if patience were a language he spoke fluently. When I hesitated, he didn't correct me sharply. He watched, listened, and then said things like, "Take your time," or "You're allowed to try." Those words settled deeper than he could have known. I realized how unfamiliar encouragement had become to me. At home, effort went unnoticed. Improvement was expected but never celebrated. I had grown used to doing things quietly, efficiently, without needing acknowledgement. But in that small music room, effort was seen. When I played a passage correctly after struggling with it for weeks, he smiled and said, "See, you trusted yourself." It startled me. I hadn't thought of it that way. Trusting myself felt like something I used to do in another life. I started practicing more at home, not loudly, not confidently, but persistently. My husband barely reacted. Sometimes he left the room. Sometimes he asked if I was done because he needed quiet. I didn't argue. I simply closed the lid and carried the unfinished music back inside me. It became clear that the piano wasn't the problem. My growth was inconvenient. It reminded him that I was changing, that I wasn't just maintaining things anymore. During lessons, my teacher asked gentle questions, not intrusive ones. He asked what kind of music made me feel something, what I enjoyed playing, what frustrated me. No one had asked me those things in a long time. I caught myself talking more, explaining, reflecting. He listened fully without interruption. That alone felt intimate in a way I wasn't prepared for, not romantic, not inappropriate, just attentive. There was one afternoon when I missed several notes in a row and stopped, embarrassed. I apologized automatically, the way I always did. He shook his head and said, "Don't apologize for learning." Something tightened in my chest. I realized how often I apologized for existing imperfectly, for not being easy, for needing time. I wondered when that habit had formed. At home, conversations remained surface level. Schedules, groceries, responsibilities. I stopped trying to share my excitement about progress because it felt childish in the face of indifference. Instead, I carried those moments quietly, replaying them when doubt crept in. The encouragement I received during lessons didn't push me toward my teacher. It pushed me back toward myself, and that was the most unsettling part. I wasn't falling for a person. I was rediscovering a version of me that hadn't been allowed much space to breathe. Some nights, lying beside my husband, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself uncomfortable questions. Was it wrong to feel stronger somewhere else? Was I betraying my marriage by enjoying encouragement that wasn't coming from home? Or was I simply responding to something I had been missing for too long to ignore? The answers didn't come easily. But one truth did. I was no longer numb. And once you feel that shift, it's impossible to pretend you haven't. Something inside me continued to grow, quietly but steadily, like a muscle I hadn't realized had been unused for years. The more I played, the more confident my hands became, and with that confidence came something deeper. I started trusting my instincts again, not just in music, but in how I felt, how I thought, how I existed. My teacher noticed it before I did. He didn't praise me excessively or make grand statements. He simply adjusted the difficulty of the pieces he gave me and said, "You're ready for more." No one had told me that in a long time. That simple belief stayed with me long after I left the lesson room. It followed me home, into my quiet kitchen, into conversations that felt increasingly one-sided. My husband noticed changes, but not in the way I hoped. He commented that I seemed distracted, that I was in my head lately. When I tried to explain that I felt more like myself, more alive, he smiled politely and said I was reading too much into things. The gap between us widened, not because of anger, but because of dismissal. I wasn't asking him to fix anything. I just wanted him to care. At the piano studio, encouragement continued, steady and respectful. My teacher never crossed a line. In fact, he reinforced boundaries in ways that made me feel safe. When I doubted myself, he redirected the focus back to my effort, my discipline, my progress. He spoke about growth as something internal, something earned. It wasn't about him believing in me. It was about me learning to believe in myself. And that distinction mattered more than I realized at first. Still, guilt crept in. Not because I was doing something wrong, but because I felt something right that wasn't coming from my marriage. I questioned myself constantly. I replayed conversations in my mind, wondering if I was being unfair, if I was expecting too much. My husband had never promised to be my source of motivation, had he? But then I wondered why wanting encouragement from the person you share your life with felt like asking for too much. One evening, after a particularly good lesson, I sat alone in my car longer than usual before driving home. I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked steadier, calmer, stronger, and that scared me. Because strength changes things. It demands honesty. It refuses to stay quiet forever. I knew I couldn't keep growing in one space and shrinking in another without something eventually breaking. I didn't talk to my teacher about my marriage. I didn't need to. The contrast spoke loudly enough on its own. One environment nurtured me, the other tolerated me. And once that truth settled in, it was impossible to unsee it. I wasn't emotionally attached to him. I was attached to the feeling of being capable again, of being encouraged without conditions, of being seen without having to perform. Lying in bed that night, I asked myself the question I had been avoiding. If I continued like this, quietly collecting strength from somewhere else while my marriage remained unchanged, what would that mean? Was I being patient, or was I postponing an inevitable reckoning? I turned the question over and over, knowing there were no easy answers. And then another thought surfaced, one that made my chest tighten with recognition. If you were in my place, craving encouragement you never received at home, and finding strength in a place you never expected, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I truly want to read your thoughts. I fell asleep knowing one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, I could no longer pretend I didn't feel the difference between being merely supported and being truly seen. Clarity arrived quietly, not as a dramatic moment, but as a steady understanding that settled into me over time. I began to see my piano lessons for what they truly were. They were not an escape from my marriage, and they were not a replacement for emotional intimacy. They were a reminder of who I was when I felt encouraged, when my efforts were acknowledged, when my presence mattered. The strength I was finding did not belong to my teacher. It belonged to me. He had simply reflected it back. There was a moment during one lesson when he paused me mid-piece. I assumed I had made a mistake, but instead he said, "You don't need to play softer to be accepted. Play the way the music asks you to." The words landed deeper than he intended. I realized how often I softened myself in my marriage to avoid inconvenience. How often I minimized my needs to maintain peace. Hearing someone tell me that my full presence was allowed felt almost revolutionary. What mattered most was that my teacher never encouraged dependence. He never implied that I needed him. When I spoke about frustration, he redirected the focus inward, reminding me that progress came from my own commitment. There was no emotional pull, no blurred boundary. And in that respect, he showed me something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Respect. The kind that doesn't take, doesn't demand, doesn't confuse support with control. At home, the contrast sharpened. My husband noticed my growing confidence and seemed unsettled by it. He asked why I was so serious lately, why I needed piano lessons so much. I tried to explain that it wasn't about music. It was about feeling alive again. He laughed lightly and said I was overanalyzing things. That response hurt more than anger would have. It told me my inner world still wasn't being taken seriously. One evening, I finally said what I had been holding back. Not accusingly, not emotionally, just honestly. I told him I felt unseen, unsupported, and quietly lonely in our marriage. I told him I missed being encouraged by the person I loved. He listened, but his reaction was restrained, careful, almost defensive. He said he didn't know I needed that kind of validation and asked why it suddenly mattered so much now. I didn't have a perfect answer. I only knew that it always had. The conversation ended without resolution. No promises, no arguments, just an understanding that something fundamental had been exposed. I felt strangely calm afterward. Strength had replaced desperation. I wasn't begging anymore. I was acknowledging reality. During my next lesson, I realized something else. I no longer needed my teacher's encouragement in the same way. I appreciated it, but I wasn't dependent on it. The confidence I carried into the room was already mine. He noticed the change and smiled, saying simply, "You're standing differently." I was. I understood then that growth doesn't always lead you toward someone. Sometimes it leads you back to yourself, and from there, forces you to reevaluate everything else. I wasn't choosing between my marriage and another person. I was choosing whether I would continue to live quietly diminished or fully present in my own life. That realization didn't make the path forward easier, but it made it honest. And for the first time in a long while, honesty felt less frightening than silence. The next few weeks unfolded with subtle but undeniable changes. I approached my husband with the same honesty I had begun to practice in myself. Not with accusations, not with ultimatums, but with quiet observations of our lives together. I shared small victories, like finishing a challenging piano piece or feeling a sense of pride in my own decisions, and I noticed the subtle shifts in how I carried myself. Confidence isn't loud. It creeps in quietly until one day you realize you've been walking differently all along. At home, the atmosphere began to adjust. I could feel the tension in my own body ease when I allowed myself to speak and act with autonomy. My husband noticed. Sometimes he commented, almost awkwardly, on how I seemed lighter or more focused. I smiled, letting him see me, but I didn't expect gratitude or understanding. The change wasn't about him. It was about reclaiming my presence, my voice, my life. There were moments of confrontation, of course. Conversations about responsibilities, about feelings, about neglect surfaced naturally. I no longer avoided these topics out of fear, but approached them with clarity and a measured tone. And even though his responses often fell short of the encouragement I needed, I didn't feel empty anymore. I had learned that strength is often quiet. That true encouragement can come from within, and when external validation fails, self-belief is what carries you forward. One evening, after a long day at work, I sat at the piano and played through pieces that once felt impossible. My fingers moved across the keys with ease, and for the first time in months, I felt completely untethered from worry or expectation. I realized the lessons were not just about music, they were about endurance, focus, and the courage to confront limitations. Every note I played was a small affirmation of my resilience. Every chord a reminder that life could still surprise me with beauty, even in the places I once felt constrained. It was also during this period that I began reflecting on the larger picture of my marriage. I considered how I had allowed patterns of neglect and emotional absence to persist for years. I recognized the subtle ways I had diminished myself to preserve the peace, the compromises I had accepted silently, and the quiet hope that one day he would offer the support I craved. But that hope had always been fragile because it relied on someone else changing. I realized my strength could not wait for him. It had to emerge from me. The clarity this brought was both liberating and frightening. I understood that the love I still carried for him didn't have to be abandoned, but the way I defined my worth could no longer depend on him. I began setting small boundaries, communicating my needs clearly, and allowing myself the grace to prioritize my emotional health. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't disrespect. It was survival, the survival of my spirit, of my ambition, and of the love I held for myself. My piano teacher continued to be a quiet presence, offering guidance without pressure, encouragement without expectation. Through his mentorship, I realized that nurturing oneself doesn't diminish relationships, it strengthens them, or it illuminates what must change. I no longer looked to him as a substitute for the support I didn't receive at home. I saw him as a catalyst, someone who reminded me that human beings thrive when they are affirmed and allowed to grow, and that absence of encouragement can become an opportunity for self-discovery rather than despair. Then, one quiet evening, as I closed the piano bench after a long session, my husband came into the room. He stood for a moment, observing me without comment, and I realized that nothing had been demanded, nothing forced. I simply existed in my own power, and that presence spoke louder than words. He finally said softly, "I see you. I didn't realize." His admission was hesitant, but it held a hint of recognition I had been craving. I smiled, not because the moment was perfect, but because it was real. It was then that I understood the truth. Life doesn't always provide the validation we expect from those closest to us. Sometimes, the encouragement, the support, and the affirmation we seek must be discovered elsewhere. And when that happens, we learn not just to survive, but to flourish. We learn that our worth is inherent, that our dreams matter, and that the life we wish to live can begin as soon as we grant ourselves permission to pursue it. I share this story now because I know many of you might feel stuck, unappreciated, or unseen in your own lives. Perhaps you are waiting for someone else to offer the encouragement that never comes. If that's you, I want to ask, would you be in my place? What would you do? Tell me in the comments. I love reading your thoughts. Your voice matters. And remember, your strength is not measured by others' recognition, but by the courage to embrace your own journey, even when it feels lonely. That night, I sat back, hands resting on the piano keys, and realized I had found a power my husband never gave me. It wasn't taken. It wasn't borrowed. It was mine. And from that power came clarity, resilience, and a quiet, unshakable hope for everything that lay ahead. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm that felt different, not because everything had changed outwardly, but because my perspective had shifted entirely. I noticed details I had once overlooked, The way morning sunlight danced across the living room floor, the subtle creak of our old wooden stairs, the smell of coffee brewing, and the calm sound of rain against the window. These were ordinary moments, yet they held extraordinary weight when experienced with presence. I realized that life's richness doesn't come from grand gestures, but from the quiet awareness of being alive, of being fully awake to one's own journey. My relationship with my husband also evolved, though slowly. There were days when the old distance crept back in, moments when I felt unseen or dismissed, but I no longer responded with frustration or resignation. Instead, I leaned into my own strength, reminding myself of the person I had become through the encouragement of my piano teacher and the work I had done on myself. I could choose calm over conflict, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over silent compromise. My own validation became my anchor, and in turn, I found that our interactions carried more authenticity, even if imperfect. Music continued to be my sanctuary. Every piano session became a conversation with myself, a dialogue of emotions I couldn't always articulate in words. Notes became my expression, melodies my voice, and the rhythm my heartbeat. Through this, I understood that personal growth is rarely linear. It arrives in waves, sometimes subtle, sometimes overwhelming, but always transformative. And the realization that I could create beauty, even amidst pain or neglect, instilled a sense of empowerment I had never known. One evening, after a long day, I found myself reflecting on the contrast between the encouragement I had received and the absence of it at home. My husband sat nearby, absorbed in his own work, unaware that I was contemplating the shifts in our lives. I didn't need him to notice. I only needed to acknowledge that I had grown beyond the need for external validation. The love I had for him remained, but it was now grounded in clarity rather than expectation. I had learned that one could love deeply and still maintain boundaries, and that self-respect and affection are not mutually exclusive. During a quiet night at the piano, I recalled the first lesson with my Italian teacher. The way he had listened, observed, and encouraged me without judgment. Those moments had seemed small at the time, yet their impact was monumental. They reminded me that sometimes the right encouragement comes from unexpected places, and that nurturing oneself is an act of courage as much as it is a necessity. I felt gratitude, not just for the lessons, but for the clarity they had brought. That strength cultivated independently carries a resonance far deeper than any fleeting affirmation from others. As I closed the piano lid, I realized that I had reclaimed a piece of myself that had been dormant for years. I had learned to act in alignment with my values, to pursue passions without guilt, and to embrace my own voice fully. And in doing so, I had discovered a profound truth. Life does not wait for validation. It rewards the brave, the persistent, and the self-aware. Those who take the time to nurture their inner world create a foundation unshakable by neglect, misunderstanding, or disappointment. Looking at my husband, I felt a sense of calm acceptance. I no longer yearned for recognition from him in the same way. Our relationship had transformed into one where mutual respect and understanding could grow organically, or it could exist separately without diminishing my sense of self. I had learned that love, in its healthiest form, is a choice grounded in clarity, not desperation. I could continue to love him, but I would not lose myself in doing so. And so, I end this chapter with a message to anyone who may feel unseen or unsupported. Sometimes, the encouragement we seek must be discovered within. And when it is, it can illuminate every corner of life, guiding us toward resilience, self-respect, and joy. Would you be in my place? What would you do? Tell me in the comments. I love reading your thoughts. Your choices matter, and your strength is waiting to be claimed. That night, as I turned off the lights and allowed the quiet to fill the room, I felt a sense of completion. I had grown, I had reclaimed, and I had flourished. My Italian piano teacher had ignited a spark, but the fire was mine to tend. And in tending it, I discovered a power that no absence of encouragement, no lapse of attention, and no shadow of doubt could ever diminish. I was whole, resilient, and free. And for the first time, I understood that true strength comes not from anyone else, but from the courage to nurture oneself.